So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Grandmaster's Fireside Chat. The Grandmaster is in Europe at the European Conference, along with the pre-CW, Tom. So they are out of the country, and our Deputy General Grandmaster is in England. So in order of progression, that makes me, to quote Alexander Haig, in charge here in the United States. So I would remind everybody this is a recorded event. If you do not wish to be recorded, you may exit now. It will be available. The recorded copy will be available for you to view at a later time. I ask you all to remain on mute while the presenter is making his presentation. And with that, I would like to introduce our presenter for tonight, the Northeast Regional Deputy, Right Powysson Companion, Sandy Karstens. Sandy, take it away.
Wonderful, thank you. So this is a talk that I had sort of inspired by the fact that I watch. I'm in the education business, and I teach at the college. So education for me, of course, is something that is important. And I'm always, observing how people react to education. And it always seems to me that what people tend to look at education, they see it as kind of a sort of a chore or something that they have to get through. And we have markers for these, and certainly from the Masonic perspective, we look at this as saying, well, I've got my third degree, and so I think, I'm all done. I've done my catechism, so I've got my third degree, so I'm all done. And we'd say, well, okay, we're going to go into Royal Arch, or we go down the Scottish Rite, and once you complete a degree, maybe the education stops again. So it's always amusing to kind of watch that people sort of see this as something that you have to get through rather than something that's a little bit more of a lifelong journey. So this talk is entitled Love of Learning is the Guide of Life, and it's reflections on the Phi Beta Kappa motto, which is what that is, Love of Learning is the Guide of Life, and the Fellowcraft degree. So the essay itself grew out of a talk I gave on the Fellowcraft degree in a couple of different iterations. And I finally wrote down my thoughts on this, and hopefully you'll appreciate a little bit about what I have to say here. The Fellowcraft degree itself being related to the idea of the educated man, the Phi Beta Kappa connection seemed wholly appropriate. And so I was particularly inspired also by an article by John Churchill, who was the former secretary of the National Phi Beta Kappa Society. It was an article he'd written, and I read it and I said, wow, this is great. And so I've kind of taken a little bit of liberties to quote a little bit from what he presented there. For a little background, the Phi Beta Kappa is the nation's oldest and most prestigious honor society in the United States. It was founded on December 5th, 1776. And I hope you'll all recognize that as a rather particularly important year in our country. So you can realize that the birth of our country was at the same time the birth of the Phi Beta Kappa institution. And a strange bit of irony, though, this new society was considered secret, complete with its own signs, grips, and door knocks. So it sounds a little familiar. And it ceased to be secret in the early 1800s, like a lot of these sorts of societies, most likely as a result of the fallout from the Morgan affair. Part of the mission of the Phi Beta Kappa Society is to recognize those students who have excelled in the liberal arts and sciences, hence the Fellowcraft degree. The actual motto is formed from the Greek letters Phi, Beta, and Kappa, and the Greek words are Philosophia, Biou, Kubernetes. If you kind of translate it, it basically comes to love of wisdom is the guide of life, although some scholars suggest that pilot is a better word than guide. So you might say that it's the love of wisdom is the pilot of life, which is presumably a better translation of the word Kubernetes. I'll leave the Greek scholars to argue that, but the point is that you've got something that is a guide or a pilot or something that helps you in life. The term philosophia is closer to the word wisdom rather than learning, but I kind of like the idea of to learn, which is a verb. And it kind of motivates more action rather than something a little more deep philosophical in the background. So it's less abstract and less of a passive term than wisdom. So I like the idea of learning. And so this is why they tend to use that as their motto, rather than the true translation of philosophia to something that's a little more interesting. But either way, the motto is a call for all of us to embrace a life rich in learning and relates to a core theme of the Fellowcraft degree as it appears in the middle chamber lecture. Hopefully you remember that a little bit. I've often been dismayed by education in our country because it seems more about requirements, as I kind of mentioned a little earlier, rather than something to nurture as intrinsically enjoyable. We have milestones like tests, certificates, levels, and so on. But to me, education appears to be more of a box to check, a chore, a requirement to fulfill, and then we move on. Of course, there are practical needs of education that we can't ignore, but I think we've lost sight of the deeper message of learning for its own sake. And it's interesting because when we talk about the third degree and we say, okay, I've reached the third degree, so I'm all done now, may seem to be lurking in people's minds. And we kind of see that in some other contexts too. If you're in the Catholic faith, you know that confirmation is one of those sort of big steps that your kids go through. And what was interesting is a talk given by an individual who was looking at the confirmation experience and saying a lot of students and parents alike look at that as being, oh, it's a culmination. I'm done learning. And in fact, he turned it on its head to basically say, no, in fact, that's where the door was open for you now. And I think that's the same kind of thing that happens in our degrees. And it was also mentioned for anybody that's been in the martial arts. You know, we all know the big black belt saying, wow, you know, I've reached the black belt, so I've kind of finished my learning. And in fact, most of them will tell you that that's the beginning of your learning. And I want to kind of turn that whole concept, forward, and to give you an idea that to me is what this is about. A lot of times it's you've reached a door. The door is now open to you to really go forward in all of the kinds of joy of learning itself. So ultimately, the liberal arts and sciences were thought to, quote, liberate the person to be a free and learned thinker. In early days, they consisted of, as we know, the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. I think we're all born with an innate sense of wonder. Just watch any kid looking at nature around them, and just the desire to learn. But somehow we lose it along the way. Education has become a means to an end, not something to be valued or even enjoyed in and of itself. There was an article that I ran into a long time ago in Newsweek by a writer. Her name was Meg Greenfield, and she called the title was Creating a Learning Society. In it, she states, education is not about getting ahead. It's about discovering the joy of learning itself. And this is the message that I'm trying to get across here, is that I really think that we've lost sight of that, just the sheer joy of picking up a book and learning something new every day. But, of course, if you've been at a Masonic meeting, mention education, and quite frankly, maybe in any other situation, and you can almost hear a collective sigh. It's like, oh boy, here we go again. We're going to be lectured to or whatever. And it's just, that reaction to me is so foreign. It's like, here's an opportunity for you to learn something new and carry it forward and look a little deeper into the effect. Well, that's exactly what I think was on the mind of this writer for the Phi Beta Kappa Society. I think this is what caught his attention of John Churchill when he wrote an article in the Key Reporter. This is the Society's flagship newsletter, and it's entitled Why Love of Learning, hence kind of my title. In the article, he states by mentioning one of the 7 deadly sins, sloth. He admits that when he hears the term, he can't help but think about that lethargic creature sleepily creeping along, the paragon of laziness. And I must admit, that's the image that came to mind for me as well, and perhaps that probably came to your minds as well too. But if we consider this more carefully, why should laziness be classified as a deadly sin? After all, if that were truly the case, many of us may be in a little bit of trouble. No, according to the classification of sins in that day, it meant something else. It meant not caring, indifference, in a profound sort of way. And if you stop and think about that in our culture today, it does take on a very disturbing significance. Interestingly, John mentions how 3 of the sins of excessive appetite, lust, greed, and gluttony, are balanced by this one sin of sloth, indifference, not caring. Amusingly, he says that if one puts the term knowledge in front of the excessive sins, lust, greed, and gluttony, foreknowledge is basically a positive thing, even if it is or sounds a little bit odd. But indifference to knowledge, not caring about knowledge, retains its viciousness, he says. The claim is that knowledge is an intrinsic good and that it is the guide of life. Briefly, for him, life offers choices, and some of life's choices matter. If, when we choose, we think we've made a choice better than some alternative, surely we can say why. But I think it goes even further than that. Knowledge, to me, in its broadest and deepest sense, is transformative. It changes you if you let it, and profoundly affects your very being, your perspective, and your understanding of the vast world around you. This is really, to me, at the heart of the ritual that we go through in Masonry. When you really think about that transformative experience, that to me is exactly what this is all about. It's spiritual in many ways, but also it's to basically kind of introduce you to what's out there in the world to say, my goodness, this is stuff I hadn't even thought about. This to me is why it's so important as part of the fellowcraft degree. It's the second degree that we confront. So ultimately, it must have been pretty darn important. Although it seems in our society that it's uncool or to be smart or to like learning for learning's sake, just go into any high school and you can kind of pretty much get the sense that, you know, this is not the thing. We all have to go through it, but boy, I can't wait till we're done. It's like eating your vegetables or something. The fact is that humans have always been pushing knowledge frontiers and trying to learn newer and more fascinating things about the world and the universe in which we live. How is it we're able to get to the moon? How is it we're looking at the stars with these modern telescopes that we've got? Clearly, somebody thought that this was a cool idea to learn. It just seems that it's hard to get people to appreciate that. So ultimately, enter the fellowcraft. Freemasons are meant to be countercultural. In a sense, that was part of our beginnings. The 7 Liberal Arts and Sciences section of the Middle Chamber lecture is devoted to understanding these particularly early days. Quote, Freemasonry had its beginnings in the age of darkness, when learning was open only to the few, a small privileged class, end quote. Maybe we've become too complacent about education because we take it for granted. And that's a very common theme. Something that we just figure is always there. We don't think about it too much. And that's why often we say freedom isn't free. We take for granted the freedoms that we have in this country and realize that ain't so in so many other places. And I think the same thing is true for education. We're so used to the fact that it's so easy to come by that we just take it for granted. But we are ultimately told in the lecture, our ancient brethren, quote, regarded the civilization, the cultivation of the mind as both the right and the duty of every man. Freemasonry is the friend and champion of education and learning and of intellectual freedom and progress. We're told right up front here that this is something that is our charge as Masons. We're supposed to be the learned members of society more than the average person. This is the countercultural part. And I think ultimately it behooves us to be taking that mantle and realize that this is so important for us, not only for our own ritual and understanding about Freemasonry, but about the world itself in which we live. To me, this looks like a very clear directive. We are admonished to become the educated man in the world, to self-improve, and to be that shining, learned example for all to see. We are even told in the symbolism that the fellowcraft comes out of ignorance into knowledge. And just like the Phi Beta Kappa Society, he is urged to be diligent in the study of the liberal arts and sciences. Our second degree, therefore, directs us to this constant life of learning, and not just as a means to get ahead in life, but rather for the sheer joy of it. Since our symbolic degrees form the basis of all other Masonic organizations, it should infuse every aspect of what we do and who we are in the fraternity and beyond. It should be our constant pilot, our guide. And of course, all of our degrees have come some special little imprecations associated with them, not the least of which this is true for the fellowcraft. The jewels of a fellowcraft are the attentive ear, the instructive tongue, and the faithful breast. So again, I think we're given the clear directive here. What's also interesting is that the fellowcraft is charged, therefore, with embracing his educational development with a sincere passion. And so I note it is interesting to see that the penalty of a fellowcraft, if you think about it, relates to the heart, the traditional seat of passion. So that connection is clearly there. And if you reflect on those days when you were going through those 3 degrees, and the fellowcraft in particular, that heart, that passion for what we are supposed to become is the transformation that people are looking for. One of the well-known Phi Beta Kappa, on the key itself, for those that might recognize that there's a key in this, so you can kind of see that as the key of knowledge, if you will. It's the key itself is well known, and on it are several symbols, one of which is a hand pointing to 3 stars. Now, the stars themselves represent 3 things, 3 stars, 3 things, and that is the friendship, morality, and scholarship. Now, if you think a little bit, you'll realize that's almost like our tenets of friendship, morality, and brotherly love. So these things aren't too far away. And I really believe that there's a lot in common with the 2 fraternities, the Phi Beta Kappa that began our country and the fraternity of Masons, in which we are asked, nay, charged to be a well-educated contributor to society. So again, kind of getting back to this passion aspect, I've always kind of looked for ways to express the fact that we should move past what we're told. Here's the list of things that we've got to do, but we should be doing them because there's a passion there. There's a desire to learn. We want to be able to do it. How many people get home when they pick up their ritual book and dig deeper into what's going on there? How many people read up on the history? How many people read up on the spiritual aspects of our fraternity? I think sometimes for people it tends to be, well, that's for the esotericists or the academics, so it's not really for me. And I say, no, it's nothing to do with somebody that's a super academic to be able to do this. Anybody and everybody in our fraternity should be able to learn something. It doesn't mean you have to come up with a major paper, but it should mean that you're interested in learning something more about the very fraternity that you spent time getting into. So I will leave you with a quote on this kind of concept of a kind of an internal, if you will, motivation to get people to do more than just simply the minimum or what they have to do. And this comes from an individual, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who is the author of The Little Prince. Now, it's interesting because he had a life in the nautical industry, with boats and so on, and of course the Phi Beta Kappa motto, as saying the pilot of life, is a little bit of a kind of a nautical theme right there as well. But here's his quote. He says, "If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the people to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea." End quote. And that to me spells out, I think, what I would like to see in people when they begin to embrace education in its deepest sense, rather than just something that they have to do. So with that, companions, this will end the presentation portion, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I will basically stop at this point for their second portion of questions and so on. So thank you for your attention.